Hey George.
Hey Patrick,
Hey.
how are you doing?
Yeah. It's tough, but I'm doing okay. I'm doing okay.
Yeah, glad to hear it. It's been a while since we last spoke. It's been a busy year altogether, but it's good to be back with you, talking about the stuff again. Finally, in the swing of researching all of these topics again.
Yeah. It was last time I think in May.
Yeah, or March. It was definitely a long while, but yeah,
No, it's really everything is closed here. Only the supermarkets are open, and I'm trying to go every day with like a quarantine walk, like going out and do things like going outside.
yeah. That's a really good practice to have. I kind of find the same thing. If I'm just trapped in my apartment the whole time, there's some emptiness that comes out of it, and I have to go for a walk or even just go for a drive and get somewhere out of the house, or I'll go crazy. It's you know big. This is a kind of psychological terrorizing that's being inflicted on all of us. It's obviously not exactly the same thing as being in prison, but it's the same sort of principles behind it. That you isolate these people, regulate what they can do, and you're slowly breeding this attitude that they are in fact under control of some higher power. And it's the same sort of thing, the atomization of society and the demoralizing of society that Dave McGowan talked about, that has everything to do with the serial killer and spree killer phenomenon too.
Yeah, it's the same mechanisms over and over. But I really think this is the biggest psyop ever.
I think you're right. The fact that all of society all over the world and with all of these countries acting in unison is just, it's incredible, and in a bad way obviously, but it is definitely mind-blowing that it's gotten to this level.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, sometimes it's even hard to comprehend what's everything is going on. It's
Yeah.
But hey, I am so thankful the link that you sent me because they're gonna make a documentary about the connections with Dean Kroll and John Wayne Gacy and the pedophile connections and human trafficking. I mean, that's so great. I also uploaded 3 podcasts now.
Yeah, I saw. I was quite surprised. It was a friend of mine, actually, someone else from these research groups, who told me about this podcast going on, and I was stunned. I had no idea that there was someone in the fairly mainstream media, investigation discovery, who had come across all of this and was willing to, do this deep dive, not just brush it off as a bunch of lone nuts, but actually come to understand the connections between all of these characters. And I think that this podcast looks very promising so far, going into Dean Coral, talking about the Oakland County child killer, and I think that they even have, just based on my listening to it so far, some telephone conversations with Gacy that were never ever been heard before. So I think that this podcast is really promising and will hopefully break new ground and also get this information out to more people. So major props to Jacqueline Bynum, who
Yep.
is doing this podcast. I think she's amazing.
No, I'm very positive that you read some of our work because it always pops up on the Google results if you type in specific names and circumstances. So
Yeah, I would think so, and I think that's good that we've been compiling all this stuff in a central place, so that anyone who has a bit of a curiosity about this stuff can will end up coming across it and then realize that the connections are broader than what they might have initially thought. And I've noticed the same thing as well. There's this one case in Colorado that I've been looking at. It's the murder of a 10-year-old boy in 1991 named Jacob McKnight, and that has some apparent connections to the whole Pat Sullivan, meth and sex trafficking scandal that I've talked about in past episodes. And I had written about this on CAVDEF, and I recently got contacted by someone who was actually doing a book of their own on the case, and they were very fascinated by some of what I had dug up, and then they started digging up more, and we've both been swapping research back and forth and have come to the conclusion that it's very likely that there was some kind of sex ring connection behind the murder of Jacob, and that had to do with Pat Sullivan. So putting this work out there allows people to come together and really start to advance what is known about these cases.
Yeah. I also added your links on the video description box, CAVDEF from the North Fox Islands, all the connections that you made and references. So, and
Yeah,
also, I made a connection with Ben Meyers from Grand Junction that he was also implicated with the investigation of the Lust Killer, that guy, the shoe fetish, Jerry Brudos.
right. Yeah, that was very interesting as well. And actually, the detective out in Salem, Oregon, who was credited with sort of being the main person to solve the Jerome Brudos murder, or the murders that were said to be committed by Jerome Brudos. His name was Jim Stovall. He actually showed up in the Ted Bundy case as well, because if memory serves, Ann Rule actually wrote about it in her book that Jim Stovall, who was a high up person in the Salem, Oregon Police Department, he had a daughter who was a ski instructor in Vail, Colorado, and his daughter was actually good friends with Julie Cunningham, and that was actually how Ann Rule learned about the Julie Cunningham case in the first place. So and given what you said, that he was Stovall was high up in the police department and helped solve this murder, and actually Stovall was honored. Ben Meyers, who was the police chief in Salem, Oregon, had submitted Stovall to some national law enforcement awards competition, and so Meyers and Stovall actually traveled together to Atlantic City, New Jersey, for the ceremony together. So they were close. And that means that we have a connection from a couple degrees of separation between Ben Meyers and this other victim, Julie Cunningham, which of course is interesting because for people who don't know, who haven't seen this background on the Ted Bundy case before, but when Bundy was on trial in Colorado for the murder of Karen Campbell, the case primarily rested on this star witness named Elizabeth Harder, and she had supposedly identified Ted Bundy as being a mysterious man by the elevator on the day that victim Karen Campbell had disappeared. And when she was at the pretrial court hearing and was made to testify, she was asked by the prosecutor, "Do you see the person you identified in the courtroom?" And she said yes. And then instead of singling out Ted Bundy, who was sitting at the defense table, she actually singled out Ben Meyers, who was sitting in the front row in the court. And so Ben Meyers was the Pitkin County and Aspen undersheriff at the time. Before that, he had been the police chief in Grand Junction. And it just so happens that there was a massive amount of corruption in Grand Junction. A string of young women in that city were turning up mysteriously dead, and various people were blamed for these murders. But these women, strangely enough, were all connected with each other. Were all often involved in the narcotics subculture, and really there was a general pervasive sense in the Grand Junction that there was some dark force at work picking off these young women as victims, and it was all connected, and it was covered up by the powerful people there, including the chief himself, who was reported to have partied with some of these women at sex and drug parties, and then later was made to resign after an officer caught him at the bar buying drinks for his 19-year-old girlfriend while he was a middle-aged man, and then he threatened that officer. So Ben Meyers, a real sleazy piece of work, was identified as the actual perpetrator of the Karen Campbell murder, and of course every chronicler of the Bundy case claims that was just a fluke, but given Meyers' background, I find it very plausible that he could have been the actual killer. And of course, with his background in Salem, Oregon, being in the Pacific Northwest at the same time that Bundy's own crimes are apparently happening, suggests that there may have been, that it was all part of this concerted larger group that moves throughout the western United States in unison committing these crimes.
Yeah, can you? I can also recall what you said about an forgotten podcast, or it was mysteriously disappeared, and some people want to make like incriminating statements.
Yeah, I think you might be talking about. There was a podcast about the Grand Junction situation by, I believe the guy's name was Blake Higgins. It was just called Junction, and there were some interesting statements that were dug up on it. Like, for example, he had interviewed Butch Goad and Arlene Goad, who were some people in Grand Junction who had known Linda Miracle, who was one of the main murder victims from that time back in 1975, the year that all these women were being murdered in this string. And Butch and Arlene Goad basically told the podcaster that Linda Miracle and Patricia Botham were planning to come forward with some news that was going to shock the whole town. And then, right very shortly after that disclosure that they were about to come forward with some shocking news, it turned out that they were murdered in late August of 1975, and then that murder was pinned on Patricia Botham's husband, Ken Botham. He was convicted and sentenced to death, later just turned into life imprisonment. And so that case was brushed under the rug. So yeah, there were some interesting things that came out in that podcast, and unfortunately the podcast never really got off the ground. It sort of just ended after 3 episodes. But that on its own was very suggestive, and as if you want to piece together the whole story of Grand Junction, which is something that I'm still working on, there are a couple things good books and resources that would be valuable for people to check out. There is Alex French's book, The Killing Season. He's a Colorado journalist, and he seems to have taken somewhat of a mainstream view on all these cases, but he does still have many valuable tidbits of information, so I think that book is good to check out. One of the interesting things, for example, is the woman named Linda Benson, who was murdered in July of 1975 and happened to know Linda Miracle, who was murdered just a month later. Like I said, all these women were connected with each other, which adds to the likelihood that these were not random, unconnected crimes. He talks about how Linda Benson, for example, was involved in the drug trafficking subculture, and even says that Linda Benson had made this statement to the effect of, if only you knew who the dealers are, big shots, like basically saying that the drug dealers in Grand Junction were very powerful, well-connected people. So she was very familiar with that, how far this, local organized crime network went, and that obviously might have been something that would have put her in danger. And another interesting thing that came out in Alex French's book is the fact that there was a witness, Steve Goad, who was at the apartment, the apartment complex where Linda Benson has lived, was at the apartment complex on the night of her murder, and he saw this mysterious man standing in the darkness who seemed very out of place. And then later, when Ted Bundy came on the TV for the crime that he was accused of, Steve Goad had the sudden recollection of, wow, that's the man I saw. And while there's some dispute as to whether this was a genuine sighting, especially because apparently Steve Goad was put under hypnosis for part of this witness account, it certainly would appear then that there's a decent chance that either he saw Ted Bundy, that Ted Bundy was there at Linda Benson's apartment on the night of her, death, or that he was hypnotized, and somehow in the course of this hypnosis, the Ted Bundy sighting may have gotten implanted, perhaps even deliberately, with it. But either way, the fact that Ted Bundy would show up in connection with this other Grand Junction murder that was also rumored to have been linked to Ben Meyers. There are some, and also just other prominent Grand Junction cops. I recently obtained some, police files on the Linda Benson murder, and there were some interesting accounts about how one witness actually witnessed this Grand Junction, that some Grand Junction cop as a person of interest in the Linda Benson murders. So you have indications that cops are involved, and then you also have Ted Bundy himself being identified at the scene by one witness. So then you just add that to the whole. It seems that nearly every one of these cases in Grand Junction, every one of these murdered women cases in 1975 in Grand Junction has some tie to Bundy. Denise Oliverson was the first of those murders in Grand Junction, and that was just outright attributed to Ted Bundy. And then you have Linda Benson, and you have Linda Benson, who was Linda Benson, who Bundy was seen at the scene of the crime, and then you have these other Colorado crimes connected to Bundy, like Karen Campbell and also Julie Cunningham, both of whom also have connections to Myers. It just seems like the Myers is sort of the one person who just keeps showing up at key junctions throughout this entire seen, this entire set of Bundy's crimes in Colorado, and it's hard to ignore that and hard to brush it off as just a coincidence when the pattern is so striking.
Yeah, I think if you just do a simple Google results, you can find a lot of incriminating statements and illegal activities to his name. But I also want to thank you for that video archive material that you sent with all those alternative suspects, with also a suspect who was like a former Operation Phoenix guy, and other people with like homicidal tendencies.
Yeah, that was I was very glad to find that as well, and I guess it kind of harkens back to I guess a very unfamiliar, lost and forgotten time when there were actual journalists out there who were willing to do real work.
Yeah.
I think Ruth Walsh deserves a major amount of respect for being willing to go up against the mainstream prosecution narrative of this guy's obviously guilty and actually look into the evidence for herself and see if that really held up. And yeah, the fact that she was able to come up with all of this information on all of these alternative suspects was very valuable. I think definitely the one that stands out the most, and this was the one that she called Jones in her own broadcast. The guy's real name was Hugh Joseph Michael Temos. You can just, I guess, was more frequently just called Hugh Temos or Joe Temos. But Hugh Joseph Michael Temos, he had this very erratic mental history. He had worked at the other resorts in the Snowmass, at other hotels in the Snowmass resort where Karen Campbell was staying. He was known for, I guess, lewd comments towards women, violent comments towards men, and just in general, as people would describe him, not playing with a full deck. I think that was one of the set of words that people used to describe him. And also, curiously, as noted in the broadcast, he just happened to miss work on the January 12th when Karen Campbell disappeared, and then he quit and went out of town the next day. So that that alone, is very interesting and suggestive of, why, that he's a person of interest. But then what makes it all the more interesting is that Hugh Joseph Michael Temos actually was previously in the Seattle area when the 1974 murders attributed to Bundy were going on. So this is another example, like with Ben Meyers, how Ben Meyers was in the Pacific Northwest as the police chief of Salem, Oregon, and then he moves to Grand Junction, Colorado, to become their police chief at the time that Bundy has also moved his own crimes to, from the Pacific Northwest to further inland. It also happens to be the case that Temos is in the Seattle area while these murders are happening, and then he ends up moving to Colorado at the same time that Bundy himself supposedly begins committing crimes in Colorado. Temos is arrested on September 7th, 1974. I think that's or September 8th, 1970. It's like one day after the bodies of some of the victims in Seattle are found. One day later, he just suddenly decides to approach the wife of a Seattle police officer and indecently expose himself to her. And so he promptly gets arrested and sentenced for quite a while. I think he got a 180-day sentence, but clearly he didn't serve out the whole thing because within a couple months he's out and he's working in Colorado. So, just the fact that he has this background, he's in the right place at the right times, and he almost seems to be acting in a way that's trying to draw attention to himself. Approaching, of all people, the wife of a police officer in Seattle seems almost, too on the nose. And it almost, as I was studying this, it seemed like in the way that these covert operations work, that you often have, you might have a slate of backup patsies that are intended to take the fall, and you may not end up using them, but they're always there in reserve with enough circumstantially incriminating evidence if you need to. Like, in the JFK assassination, there were a lot of potential patsies that could have been used depending on where they actually decided to go through with it. We may never have heard the name Lee Harvey Oswald if the Chicago assassination plot against JFK had worked. Then we would have just heard Thomas Arthur Valley's name instead. And so in the same manner, it appears, at least to me, very likely that Hugh Joseph Michael Temos was being, basically being maneuvered around the country by somebody that he was, laying a trail that was meant to point to him as this interstate mass murderer. And for whatever reason, he was dismissed. The case against him never developed, and so at that point, they eventually graduated to making a case against a slightly higher level, but still relatively lower level and expendable person like Ted Bundy to tie him to these murders instead. When in actuality, it's very likely that, given that Meyers instead was identified as being the killer, the suspicious person in proximity to Karen Campbell, and knowing Karen Campbell's own background with her family, the fact that her brother Robert Campbell was a Fort Lauderdale police officer who would have likely been in a capacity to deal with drugs and major organized crime networks in the area at the time, it's possible that there was a targeted hit and that Meyers was somehow involved in carrying it out for that reason, or just that Meyers was a powerful person who wanted to indulge some sick fantasy and he had to be covered for it. But ultimately, you see these multiple layers of potential patsies like Temos and then later Bundy being maneuvered into position to help ensure that the real higher level people who were actually running these networks of organized crime and organized violence get off.
I think Temos also has made a statement that he drank his own urine.
Yeah, or at least inmates who were in the jail with him, they observed that fact about him, and it's certainly a lot of this stuff is this is indicative of the same kinds of accounts you would see in ritual abuse cases too. These tendencies of drinking your own urine, he was seen to just be laughing to himself hysterically in a corner.
Yeah.
He had all sorts of obvious indications that he was not of sound mind. And of course, when you see that obviously raises the question of, could this person be mentally unstable to the point where he's actually able to be used and manipulated by others? Because someone who's a mental patient, or someone who clearly should be a mental patient, that's often goes hand in hand with mind control. That so many of these facilities are co-opted and used for that purpose. So when you see someone like Temos in that capacity, it does raise a lot of red flags about what his real purpose is and if anyone could be controlling him somehow.
No, I can always see for myself why they chose eventually Ted Bundy, because he was like so arrogant and also narcissistic. So he was
Right. It was definitely, you have to admittedly, it was a very powerful and effective.
I also
established.
Yeah, excuse me. I also really think that they put murders under his name that he actually didn't commit, but they knew he did others. But he was so arrogant, so narcissistic that he really thought he could beat the system. But nevertheless, they will fucking always railroad him.
Yeah, I think that there's a good chance you're right about that. Certainly when you get into this conversation and you start challenging the official narrative of the Bundy case, a lot of people are going to jump down your throat for even suggesting such a thing, and I think it speaks to the effectiveness of how this version, this profile of Ted Bundy as this lone nut, lady killer type person, the charming sociopath. You think of Ted Bundy and all this stuff immediately comes to mind. Almost everyone who has this basic familiarity with these major crimes, they know exactly what kind of person we're supposed to think of when you hear that name. It's just been seeded into our culture so effectively. And so when you try to propose that maybe what we were told about the case wasn't really what happened, there's just so much resistance to it. People don't want to revise this viewpoint because it's just so ingrained. And that obviously...
No, yeah, they put like 36 names to his name, and many of them, like, there are way better suspects, way better alternative motives. It is but for good order, I really think that Bundy committed like 5 murders, maybe completely on his own, but the others,
Yeah, and that's sort of the thing about Bundy is, if you, and I've noticed this, I'm actually daring enough sometimes to try and bring this up to people in my own personal life who tell them my own suspicions, and of course I'm known as the resident conspiracy theorist for even talking about this stuff, but I go on it and do it anyway. And the problem that you often run into is people are like, well, what does it matter? They can't really dispute the evidence itself because obviously it's all based in verifiable facts. But if you bring it up, the reaction sort of is, well, what do I care? He's still a murderer. He's still guilty of something. So what does it matter if it's 1 or 35? If he's innocent of 1, he's still guilty of a bunch more. And that's sort of the issue. You've taken someone who is obviously not a very sympathetic character and does clearly have violent tendencies, and probably was. I think Bundy certainly is involved in a number of murders. I don't think, however, but that doesn't negate the fact that the evidence against him for many of the murders he was actually convicted of is very shaky and indicative of him being set up in so many of these cases. And
He was convicted.
One of the things that the serial killer phenomenon does too is it sort of allows the justice system to be very perverted, and also creates a culture where people just accept it. People are willing to abandon the standards of evidence that are necessary in a fair system with due process. They don't really care that much about requiring that the case for every murder be proven, as long as you can demonstrate, pull in enough circumstantially incriminating factors. If you introduce prejudicial evidence of previous crimes that aren't even related to the current crime under consideration, the people are very willing, because of this whole serial killer mythos that's been set up, to really just label a person as guilty, not have any curiosity about the actual circumstances of the crime. They just want to pin it on the easily identifiable monsters and then go back to sleep. And the whole Bundy situation really is one of the archetypal examples of helping that process along.
Yep.
It just is very frustrating when you try to reason it out with other people. But really, the core of the matter is it's not about trying to clear Bundy's name. Certainly, I'm not trying to make Bundy out to be some kind of unsung hero or virtuous person. It's not about Bundy. It's about the truth of what happened, and it's about getting justice for all of these women and girls who were murdered. And if there were people who escaped any sort of punishment for what they did, and it appears that was the case time and again. Ben Meyers, of course, is the biggest example of that I can point to, but it's also likely in the Pacific Northwest crimes, for example, that Bundy probably was involved, but also involved with a larger cult of people, none of whom have been identified beyond Bundy himself. There are many perpetrators who never were punished for these crimes, even though they were likely involved in them, are still out there. And that's the thing that matters, that having this one easily identifiable scapegoat allows so many other people to go free and keep doing what they've been doing.
Yeah, it was like 3 days ago I saw on Netflix a documentary about the Yorkshire Ripper. The Ripper, it was called. And I was thinking about what is like the ultimate motive for like government agencies who are like using serial killers. And then I was also thinking about another documentary, Falling for a Killer, by Elizabeth Klopfer, the ex-girlfriend of Ted Bundy. And I really think this is a little bit what happened, that you had like Seattle 1970, and it was like a lot of political activism, fighting for equal rights, feminist movement, and it all changed when the Bundy murders happened. And you also have the same thing with the Yorkshire Ripper. You had like the 1970s over there, also political activism. For 5 years, women couldn't go out at night on the street on their own. They had to be accompanied by a man, and also like fighting for equal rights. It's almost like a sort of rehearsal and for pandemic, for curfews and social engineering.
Yeah, that's a very astute point. It's something that I hadn't even been familiar with a lot of that, but it does seem like if you bring in, put the population in a sufficient climate of fear, that you can start advancing the argument that, well, it's time to stop caring about these, stop pushing the envelope, stop trying to get any kind of social progress. We're worried about your, bare basic survival. It's a good way to diffuse so much of this, pent up anger about the problems in society, and just try to, in a sick way, trying to get people to essentially unify behind a government, make people think, well, the government's looking out for you again. It just, really seems to take the air out of the room in so many of these important movements. And I think that the same pattern you could see with Charles Manson, for example,
Yeah,
as well.
killing the
He,
hippie movement.
yeah, right, the crimes that he committed, and it was all called this hippie. It was made to seem like this hippie cult when obviously it was a paramilitary commune, teeming with CIA and naval intelligence operatives. But that was what it was portrayed as in the media, and it was very easy at that point to make it seem like the entire, all of these anti-establishment movements were powder kegs likely to be violent, when of course it was really that the most prominent anti-establishment groups that you hear about were set up to deliberately, cause these violent events and discredit themselves. And
Yep.
I think that what you observed with what happened in England with the Yorkshire Ripper is another very great example of that. That people's rights were, especially women's rights in that time, were just taken away after that, supposedly with public safety being the reason. But that's always what the government uses to justify the repressive measures. That it's
But
for public
George,
safety.
also with Bundy murders, if you see that the documentary Falling for a Killer, the first episodes are like subtext for really demonstrating what has really happened. It's like the cover up is like the Ted Bundy. We're waiting for Ted Bundy, but it's really like many times spent in the whole political activism, equal rights, feminist movements. It's really uncanny. It's really a pattern.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it really is an interesting convergence you brought up, that it was right in the middle of all of these social justice movements, and then suddenly you get a serial killer sent in to ruin the whole thing.
Yeah, that is it. Yeah, yeah. But George, can you please also tell us about your findings that you did on the program to kill .net forum on Donna Manson?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. That was another one of the recent, set of documents that I got, I guess, a month or two ago. So Donna Manson was one of the women in the string of, purported Bundy victims in the Pacific Northwest in the first half of 1974. She was in Olympia, Washington. She was attending the Evergreen State College, and I guess I should just note right off the bat, there were some there are other interesting people who've attended the Evergreen State College. For example, Matt Groening, who was the creator of The Simpsons and also a pal of Jeffrey Epstein, who purportedly was serviced, for lack of a better word, by some of Epstein's victims. He also attended the Evergreen State College during the same period.
Freemason.
Over the 70s, overlapping Donna Manson for at least part of it. And he had even said, it was the classic, hippie college where all the misfits of the, U.S. would go. There were no grades, no classes. So it was kind of just a big, even back then, a big petri dish, a sort of social experiment teeming with these social justice types, and also undoubtedly plenty of covert operatives. And anyway, there were a number of interesting things that came up in these files about Donna Gail Manson, and some of them building on what Ann Rule and others talk about in their books, and also, really fleshing it out even more. One of the things that was brought up in Ann Rule's books about Donna Gail Manson that really stood out to me was her fascination with her apparent fascination with a lot of occult and magical type beliefs, and her interest in parapsychology phenomena like ESP, for example. And the reason that stood out is because this is exactly the same time, and exactly, these are the exact things that it's known for a fact that the CIA was researching as part of their MKUltra project. The CIA was interested in using clairvoyance and mediums and magicians. They were interested in people who were supposedly had extrasensory perception abilities, ESP abilities. So all the stuff that Donna is interested in at a personal level is stuff that the CIA is verifiably researching too. And actually, as it happens, Ann Rule even said outright that Donna Gail Manson had papers found in her possession that mentioned this thing called Thought Power Inc., which had later changed its name to the Institute of ESP, and that talked about how these authorities did a business search on these names and couldn't really find it, but it sort of was a dead end. And so I was trying to dig up these business names and see if I could find anything about these organizations, and nothing would come up under the names that Ann Rule gave in her book. So eventually I just decided, well, I want to get the police files for myself and see if they mention any of this. And so that was my main reason to get the files. And when I got the files, one of the first things that stood out was that Ann Rule had actually not been telling the truth about what this institute or whatever was. It was not called the Institute of ESP. It was called the Institute of Insight. It was also known by another name, Silva Mind Control International. It was there was this guy, I believe his name was Jose. Was it Jose Silva? Someone who had developed these, sort of new age type, mental control techniques. Jose Silva developed the so-called Silva mind control method. And there were all these different franchises around the country that supposedly implemented this. And this thing, the Institute of Insight, was part of that, but eventually broke off and was doing its own thing. But basically, they had all these sorts of seminars on, this idea that by controlling your thoughts, that you could sort of manipulate the rest of the world around you. It's a very new agey type of idea, but this is again exactly in line with what the CIA believed that you could do, and you'll even find that Paul Bonassi's own accounts talk about how he was being trained by his mind control handlers to learn these supernatural techniques for manipulating the world around him. So this is again very uncannily in line with MK Ultra's own work. So this whole Institute of Insight, this is the thing that Ann Rule was talking about, and I guess we can only speculate why she didn't give the actual name of the organization, but that was one of the major things that we find in the police files, that this is the institute that Donna was associated with, and you find that one of the president, the president of the Institute of Insight, John DeViervuer, however you say it, one of the instructors at this place, he was for some reason around the same time that Donna Manson disappeared, giving instruction in none other than Brownsville, Texas, which is right across the border from Matamoros, Mexico, where the satanic cult of Adolfo Constanzo would later be found to be operating. So that's interesting. And aside from that, knowing this type of organization that Donna was affiliated with, and one other thing, it also makes reference, for some reason, the Institute of Insight makes reference to this, what it calls the Cross of Malta, and it never elaborates on what that is, but it's likely referring to the Maltese cross, which was an emblem of the Knights of Malta, this really, a centuries-old intelligence agency affiliated with the Catholic Church that has a lot of members in the U.S. intelligence community. So it's very much appears that there's a lot of overlaps with the intelligence community with this organization. But the other major thing, or one of the other major things to come out from these Donna Gail Manson files, is learning about a certain project that she was pursuing at the Evergreen State College and who her faculty advisor was. Like I said, she was very interested in these occult things like sorcery, witchcraft, magic, and she actually wanted to do a project on them at her university. And so someone at the Evergreen State College had referred her to a man at the University of Washington's experimental campus, and this man was named Richard Allen Muller. Richard Allen Muller, at the same time, so he became Donna's faculty advisor on this project, and Richard Allen Muller, it turns out, was at the same time he was part of this group based in Washington, D.C. called Mankind Research Unlimited, which it was itself doing all sorts of parapsychology research, similar to what the Institute of Insight was doing. And even on Richard Allen Miller's website, he sort of brags about how he was involved in naval intelligence work as part of Mankind Research Unlimited, that he was the Northwest Regional Director for Mankind Research Unlimited. And so he was part of this, what appears to be this blatant spook organization. Mankind Research Unlimited was run by someone named Dr. Carl Schleicher, and Carl Schleicher, once again, was also in naval intelligence, had served overseas in various places. And something else that is incredibly interesting about this, my good friend John Brisson of We've Read the Documents, I think you've talked to him also, Patrick.
Yeah.
John Brisson, who is currently in the middle of writing a book about the Finders Cult, which I think will be really the definitive expose of that whole story. He actually found that Dr. Carl Schleicher, who ran Mankind Research Unlimited, and Marion Petty, the leader of the Finders, were sort of, they were acquaintances. They knew each other. and Marion Petty, who was known as the game caller of the Finders, in other words, the leader of the cult, said that Carl Schleicher was another game caller. So Carl Schleicher was the game caller of his own little group, was basically had a role akin to Marion Petty's own role. So you have this, even a connection between the Finders and Mankind Research Unlimited, both of which are Washington, D.C. based organizations, apparently involved, with some fascination in these mind control type studies and tactics. And it just so happens that the Northwest Regional Director of Mankind Research Unlimited, based in Seattle, is Donna Gail Manson's faculty advisor. So Donna Gail Manson has multiple associations with what appear to be very blatant MK Ultra and intelligence connected projects.
No.
And that's a very fascinating thing to come out of the files. And it sort of makes you wonder that Donna Gail Manson is already, even before her disappearance, to connect with all this stuff. It starts to appear very unlikely in that case that she was a randomly chosen victim, because what are the odds that she would have all of these associations and that she just happens to be a victim of someone like Bundy, or at least purportedly Bundy, who has all of these other links to these same kinds of MK Ultra projects as well. And make it even more interesting, there are some indications that Donna Gail Manson actually knew Ted Bundy previously. One of the things in the documents talks about Donna Gail Manson's notebooks that she had written to herself, and one of them actually mentions a person who was called Gimli, like Gimli, and Gimli was described as having a broken hand cast, which of course matches the description of what Bundy would do when he trying to lure his victims. So that's very interesting. And then it turns out, and then there were a couple sightings of Donna Gail Manson that were months after her disappearance. So in the official narrative would be that Donna Gail Manson was killed immediately by Bundy, but there are two sightings in these mentioned in these documents about Donna Gail Manson being seen, like, I think 2 months after her disappearance in March of 1974. She's being seen by people in May of 1974, and one of them has her in Vancouver with some man who is described as being a hippie type. And then there was another sighting of her in July of 1974 with a motorcycle gang called the Tribe. And then, even more fascinatingly, also in May of 1974, Donna a person who fit the description of Donna was seen by somebody who had talked to her for a bit, and Donna actually said at the time of the sighting that she was staying with a man named Ted. So that the reason why that is especially fascinating is because this was in May of 1974, and which means that was 2 months before the events at Lake Sammamish, when a person named Ted would be identified by witnesses and would become the prime suspect. So pretty much 2 months before the name Ted had any significance in this investigation, somebody saw a person who they believed was Donna, and this person said that they were staying with a man named Ted, which I think adds to the significance of the witness sighting, and really upends a lot of what people think off the bat happened to Donna. It seems that she and Ted Bundy may have had some kind of affiliation with each other that lasted before her disappearance, and that her disappearance was not just a murder, that she disappeared off the map for some other reason and remained alive for a period of several months after that. So, there's a lot of things in these police files that really challenge the conventional view of what happened to Donna in the first place.
I can also remember Kenneth Mad Dog McKenna, who made statements that he knew about Donna Manson, and that her body was, I think, being stolen and being hidden in like a cave that Bundy used, something like that.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact thing that Mad Dog McKenna said, but yeah, that sounds familiar, I think it's...
Excuse me. No, he almost reads like a mythical person, but he really existed, because I have like magazines from Australia, criminology magazines, with pictures of him and interviews. So, and he was like a satanic fort priest from the Hand of Death.
Yeah, no, I've been meaning to upload this. Actually, I did get some documents on the child molestation case that he was captured for in 1988. So I'll try to upload them soon as well. But yeah, he definitely is a real person. How much of his claims can be substantiated, I don't know yet, and that's another area of future investigation. But he is undoubtedly a real sadistic criminal in the state of Florida.
Let's go to Lake Sammamish. Denise Naslund. I found some things when I was reading the books of author Kevin Sullivan. He wrote like 4 books about Bundy. And if you can see my notes, she also worked for a company called Select Enterprise. It was a dating and an escort service. She was a receptionist and bookkeeper.
Yeah, that I did not know about that before. I think that's really fascinating. And of course, if you're a bookkeeper at an escort service, that means that you're in a position to know a lot of things about potentially some very powerful and influential people. I mean, it's the same sort of pattern that you would see play out, for example, with the DC Madam Deborah Jean Paul Free in DC in the 2000s. That if you're especially in such a central location like Seattle, and you run the service, you know all the clients, and you know all the prostitutes who are part of it, that potentially you potentially gives you the ability to have blackmail on a lot of people. So I think
Yep.
that sticks out, and that might be what she was involved in, and maybe even why she had to die. It's quite possible that she was a targeted hit instead of just a random victim once again.
Well,
And on that note about Denise Naslund working for that actually does remind me of some of the other things about Donna Gail Manson, that she is described in these police files as being a very promiscuous individual who had a lot of sexual partners and had even caught some STDs at various points, like venereal disease. And there's one witness account. I mean, the fact that she always seems to be, that in many of these accounts that there's some other man accompanying her at various points, whether it was Ted or whether it was this unknown hippie type. And also there's this other account, which I find very interesting, especially because it's actually, one of the only accounts that you'll find in the police files that specifically mentions the possibility of Ted Bundy having an accomplice who was involved with him in committing murders. Basically, there's this mention of someone named Steve Brown who was in the narcotics business, and whoever this witness is, I don't know who's reporting this, but basically they talked about a man named Steve Brown being in the narcotics business with Ted Bundy, and at one point they talk about how I think it was Ted Bundy had brought this girl from Olympia to this event where it was Steve Brown, and they had given some sort of warning like, oh, don't have sex with her, she has venereal disease. And so she was taken home after that. And just the fact that it was a girl from Olympia that they was described as having venereal disease made it seem like this was a girl who very much could have been Donna Gail Manson. And so once again, why do we have this man, another man who's just taking her around and then taking her back? A lot of this stuff adds up to the indications that Donna Gail Manson may have been forced into prostitution, that maybe she was being prostituted out by people like Ted Bundy as part of the underground enterprise. And so for you to have found that Denise Naslund was also connected with this escort service, it's interesting now that there may be as many as two supposed Bundy victims involved in this enterprise. These cults were often involved in running escort services like this. If you read about the Son of Sam murders and
Also,
the accounts of what happened in the cult, you'll see that one of the enterprises that they were said to run, especially for college-aged girls, was forcing them into prostitution.
No. Also, the victims in Grand Junction, there was also like prostitution and drug trafficking. It's always the same teams. But also, Denise Naslund, she was also an ITT Peterson school. She went to that school as a computer programmer. Now, get this, it's 1975, 1974. Computer programming was not that popular. I mean, isn't that a little bit of a red flag?
Yeah, I think that's very interesting as well, and especially back then, you would mainly see computers, I guess more in the military and intelligence worlds or in some parts of the corporate world, but that does, I agree, raise a red flag of the possibility that she was being, trained for this potentially some intelligence work.
Yep.
And note as well, the Finders, which I mentioned before, is having this connection with Mankind Research Unlimited, which showed up in the Donna Manson case.
And, you know,
The Finders were also connected with this computer training firm known as Future Enterprises in Washington, D.C. So, if you see someone, especially in this era, receiving any kind of computer-related training, it has to make you wonder. Uh, you know, it definitely at least raises the specter of some intelligence ties in the background, certainly.
and get this, the other girl who was abducted at Lake Samam is Janice Ott. She worked as a probation officer.
Yeah, I've heard that too, and wasn't her father, I think, was one of the parole board commissioners, if memory serves.
It's unbelievable. But also, there are so many statements made in the Sullivan books about Denise Naslund and people, her friends, that were observing motorcycle gang members throughout the whole park. And if you see like the videos that I've used a couple of times in the video series, you see a lot of motorcycle gang members in the park.
Yeah, I think, and that sort of aspect does show up a lot too. Like I mentioned, Donna Manson, by one account, was seen at a motorcycle gang party in July, and it does. And there was actually one account, I believe, was mentioned in Dave McGowan's book Program to Kill, that although most people were describing, seeing this Ted character luring these women away, there was at least one account that actually saw a woman. I don't remember whether it was Janice or Denise, but somebody witnessed this woman being taken on the back of some motorcycle and sort of screaming for help, or like screaming, I'm not going with you. So yeah, I think that it seems very likely motorcycle gangs are frequently show up as involved in these same kinds of cult networks. If you look at the story of Thomas Creech, for example, who sort of gave, I would say, overlapping accounts of, they sort of overlap with a lot of the Bundy stuff as well. There were various accounts in the Seattle police files indicating that a cult was responsible for the murders of these women, that it wasn't just a single person. And Thomas Creech was talking about the same sorts of things, and even talked about attending these ceremonies in King County, Washington, where Seattle is. And his statements about the building did, in fact, as were mentioned in news reports, check out. And so Creech basically says that motorcycle gangs were at the core of this, that he was recruited into this network of heroin dealers and contract killers centering around this motorcycle gang called the Brotherhood. And that the Brotherhood received a lot of support from organized crime, satanic cultists, and right-wing paramilitary groups. And so, you see motorcycle gangs as, I guess, really the bankrollers of this contract satanic cult and contract murder network. You see them at the Lake Sammamish, picnic at the same time that the police are having their own their own annual picnic. And you even see the possibility that motorcycle gangs were involved in taking at least one of the victims of that day from the park. And so I think that they are a very important part of the story and these networks in general. And about Lake Sammamish as well, it does seem to me that what happened there was very likely meant to derail whatever leads were being built up pointing to a cult being involved. Because if you go back to Seattle police files, it was on June 26, 1974, that they were talking about this cult, that there was one of the Seattle police officers was getting information from an informant in the drug trafficking scene about how he had sold hallucinogens to this cult, and that he had learned about how this cult was using these drugs for these sorts of ritual ceremonies during which they would hack up these girls, young women who they had abducted in these sort of cult ceremonies. So there was serious information coming forward about a cult being involved, being behind this stuff, and it appeared that they were taking it very seriously and investigating it. And then so conveniently, just 3 weeks later, another set of murders happened, but this time, whereas all the ones before had no witnesses to them, no one really knew what happened to these girl, there was no trace left behind. Suddenly, this killer decides to brazenly commit 2 murders in broad daylight and give his name Ted.
Yeah.
And it just seems like there was some awareness that the pressure was going on too much,
Yep.
and that they, had to immediately divert attention by making it very clear that there was a lone nut named Ted responsible for everything, and the cult investigation could stop now.
Guess what? I also found out that Ted owns his own 35mm camera, but does not develop his own film. So he didn't have only a Polaroid camera, but also a 35mm camera.
Oh, that is interesting. And if he's
not developing his own film, yeah, who does?
Yeah, and if he's taking any sort of illicit photographs with it, then who else would be complicit in that too?
But a Polaroid camera is also different than a 35mm camera. That is like real life images.
Right. I mean, really, having a Polaroid means you don't have to worry about having a complicit photo lab for whatever you're doing. You can just take these photos, you'll get them immediately, and you'll be able to enjoy them yourself. But if you have a 35mm, then you better have someone you can trust to develop it for you, or else they're going to see everything you're doing. So, who was it that Bundy trusted with that? I have to wonder.
No, I also found out from a cat and mouse game that Roger Dunn and Bob Keppel played when they were like monitoring his actions. 915 hours. I checked the psych department in Guthrie Hall to see if Bundy may have been en route to talk with Dr. Elizabeth Loftus, but he was not around. I think that's really telling. Yeah, this Bundy was already talking with Dr. Elizabeth Loftus, and also when he was arrested and possibly like inserted with yeah, it's really unbelievable.
Yeah, when was this that they said that he was possibly en route to talk with Elizabeth Loftus? Do you know what year it was?
Yes, it was the 13th of January 1967.
Wow. I mean, that it was it 67 or 76? Just
76. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, that is interesting. And Elizabeth Loftus, of course, for people who don't know, she was one of the big influential voices in the whole false memory movement of trying to discredit people who remembered being abused as children. She came forward with all these studies to, purportedly prove that you could implant a false memory. There was a traumatic false memory and have it be believed by the people. But obviously, it was really just dumb stuff like, oh, you can make a child believe that, they once got lost at the supermarket and separated from their parents. But obviously, people were then using those findings to try and claim, well, therefore, you can implant false memories of child abuse in a kid who's never been abused. But obviously, that whole idea is garbage. That, you can't make a child remember all the trauma associated with something that they've never actually experienced. If a child has never been sexually abused, they're not going to have even the requisite starting point to imagine what sexual trauma would be like. And so really, Elizabeth Loftus has just sort of built a career on discrediting memories to a point that is far beyond what the science would actually support. She's represented a big array of sort of celebrity clients. I think she appeared in one of Oliver North's trials. She appeared in a Scooter Libby's trial. Him, one of the national security staffers of Dick Cheney, who Dick Cheney really wanted George W. Bush to pardon, but Bush never did. And then recently, Scooter Libby was pardoned by Trump a couple years ago. So Elizabeth Loftus was on his case, and also she was on the defense of a Boston priest who was accused of child molestation named Paul Shanley. Paul Shanley, who was even at the foundation of the North American Man by Love Association. So Elizabeth Loftus appears very much to have been a hired gun for U.S. intelligence, clients who U.S. intelligence wants to protect, and also just pedophiles in general. And of course is on the board of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, along with this whole gamut of people who were involved in CIA mind control programs, and also with various pedophiles and pedophile defenders. So, a lovely person, and the fact that she was on hand to defend Ted Bundy raises the suspicion that, that Bundy himself was another one of these clients who the intelligence services were, hoping to control. They were hoping to control the outcome of that trial in one way or another. Whether they were, at the time, they were still trying to defend Bundy, or whether they were trying to railroad Ted Bundy at the time, I think that there were different interests at the time who may have wanted to do one or the other, potentially clashing up against each other. But either way, Elizabeth Loftus was likely inserted into that whole situation because she had a career of doing what the intelligence services would want her to do, and so she was an expert witness who the defense team could trust to have around.
George, do you have my notes in front of you?
Yeah, I do.
Do you have page 1 in the center? Can you read that portion with Jerry Snyder?
Yeah, I think this is from Kevin Sullivan's book 2.
Yes.
Yeah. So Jerry Snyder, a DEA agent, an undercover DEA agent assigned to Group 1 in the Seattle office. Agent Snyder is known by the nickname of Kelly, was at Lake Sammamish with his family on July 14th, 1974, and sat some distance behind Janice Ott and witnessed the interaction that Bundy had with her a little before noon on that hot and clear Sunday.
Yeah, that's also pretty telling that one of the most valuable eyewitness that they had against Ted Bundy, pointing him out at the lake, was a DEA agent undercover.
Right. Yeah, and also, why exactly is this? Why is this DEA agent really there at all? I guess probably hanging out with his law enforcement buddies at the annual picnic there. But yeah, it's a frequent pattern that you find that law enforcement or family members of law enforcement are there to provide some of the key witness sightings that end up implicating these people. The pattern just goes on and on. And it's very convenient.
Also, that guy Johnny Muller, a roommate of the Rogers rooming house in Seattle. I mean, it was never really established if he was like U.S. Air Force, U.S. State Department, or CIA.
Right, and this was actually something that I think first came out in the Seattle police files that I had obtained a year or so ago about John Muller being this roommate of Bundy. And it's interesting. I guess aside from Kevin Sullivan's book, you will never see any mention of John Muller like anywhere else in the writings about Ted Bundy. It was as if this guy never existed, which is pretty bizarre given that this is who Bundy was staying with for at least a year. And yeah, I think it's very fascinating that Muller, we don't really know what he was involved in, but according to the documents, Muller was stationed in Australia providing support for Operation Deep Freeze in Antarctica.
Yep.
He was on some kind of State Department assignment that may have been a CIA assignment. The possibility was at least real enough that John Muller's friend brought that up as potentially being what he was doing. So I think it's interesting that even from that early on that Bundy was hanging around a State Department or likely CIA person. And just to be clear, whether it was officially CIA or not, the State Department is essentially just the more legitimate, quote-unquote, legitimate arm of the CIA. The U.S. doesn't really have diplomatic relations for the purpose of actual, diplomacy. Really, we have diplomatic relations so that we have an excuse to put our intelligence officials everywhere in the world and know what's going on and be able to subvert things from within if we want to. And so the State Department and the CIA are really just two sides of the same coin. That was never made any more clear than when Alan Dulles and John Foster Dulles, two brothers, both from the Wall Street law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell, were under Eisenhower running these two agencies at the same time and obviously coordinating a lot of their activities, such as the overthrows of governments in Iran and Guatemala with each other. So, State Department assignment already more or less implies intelligence work.
Yep.
So that means Bundy is right there living with an intelligence officer.
And also the choice of location. I mean, Antarctica, that's such a mysterious place. Not many people are allowed to go there. So what the hell was his function over there?
Right, that stood out to me as well. Just that in general, Antarctica seems to be this place. I mean, you can't just casually go over there. You have to be affiliated with some, government, and you have to be given permission. So, who knows? Who knows what could really be happening over there? Some kind of classified project. It's obviously quite possible, and maybe even very likely, that people would be hiding away things that they don't want most of the world to even know exist. And so for John Muller to be at the level where he would be providing support for an operation in Antarctica already implies that he has some kind of connections or important function.
No, I shared in the thread on the forum about Johnny Muller that he wrote a letter to Detective Bob Keppel explaining his relationship with Bundy, and at the end of the letter he asked kindly to if he could receive all further information and progress on the investigation. I think that's,
Yeah, well, I mean, he would want that, wouldn't he?
yeah, exactly.
That's obviously what a spy would want to know.
Okay, I want to say one last thing about the Jeffrey Dahmer case this time, because like 3 days ago I read the book Dahmer Detective, written by Detective Peter Kennedy, and it was everything about, was the whole book was almost like the whole interrogation, so it was like very vivid. You could almost like visualize the whole circumstances. But the most interesting portion that I was actually only looking for, the only tidbit in reading the whole book, was actually that we found out that the person that sexually violated Jeffrey Dahmer on Thanksgiving was actually former process member and affiliate of the Son of Sam called John Paul Ranieri.
Yeah, I actually did come across that on the forum. I saw that the other day, and I was blown away.
Yeah,
I had
that
never
is.
would have expected that it would be him who was accused of that. And I guess really, what it sort of solidified to me was a suspicion that I've been having for a while, that John Paul Ranieri supposedly was a reformed member of the process, that he had fled and he had sort of left behind the life that he had in New York. And if he is still out there actually raping a victim, then that pretty much would imply that he never really changed.
Nope.
Because the story that he tells back then, while he was in New York, that he was recruited by, actually I think said he was recruited by John Carr, one of the process cultists at the time, into this whole process network. And at the time, what they were mainly doing was this prostitution network that was affiliated with the mafia. And so he described being prostituted out to various homosexual pedophile clients in New York at the time. I think he named people like J. Edgar Hoover and Clyde Tolson. I think he also named Cardinal Spellman, and Cardinal Spellman was one of the most powerful Catholics in the United States at the time, and he was so influential behind U.S. policy that the Vietnam War was actually known as Spellman's War, because of how much he was really a key player in pushing for it. So all these prominent people were getting serviced by this process and mob-affiliated network, and Ranieri was apparently one of the boys forced into that network. And then he described to Maury Terry how he got away from it all, that in the early 70s he heard from John Carr about what the cult was about to go in a more violent direction, and so he left and made a new life for himself in the Midwest as a street preacher. But if this account from Dahmer can be believed, then clearly he never really left that life behind. He never really left the process background behind. And actually, what that sort of made me think when I read that is that if he was raping Dahmer, that he may have been some kind of handler or conditioner for Dahmer, trying to keep him under control. Certainly that's a side of Ranieri that had never heard anything about, and never had any direct evidence until you brought that up, to suspect, to really say that he was something more than just this random street preacher who happened to run into Dahmer at some points. But now it's pretty clear that there's a lot more to the story than just that he may well have been some kind of handler. And I guess makes, in that case, Dahmer being affiliated with the Process Church would be even more likely. And of course, we also have to go back to the accounts in Arthur J. Harris's book about the Adam Walsh case, where he talks about how he had this person claiming to be Adam Walsh, and this person told him, I would say A.W., that's the name that's given in the book. A.W. had told Arthur J. Harris that Jeffrey Dahmer, the one who abducted him and then took him to this apartment where a bunch of kids were being held captive, and at the apartment they also ran into Otis Toole, and also ran into Ted Bundy, interestingly enough, which would seemingly imply that Ted Bundy even though he was supposed to be on death row at the time, was really being let out of prison to do other sick things, even after his conviction. So you have this account by A.W. that connects Otis Toole of the Hand of Death to Jeffrey Dahmer, who had a previous fixation on Satanism, had just come out of the army from Baumholder, Germany, and is now, they overlap in this, Miami-based trafficking enterprise, and quite possibly were both connected by virtue of being in the same satanic cult. So already that gives some, the sort of, and the fact that Bundy was also even linked to that too, really just suggests that we have this, there's really just this one major death cult that's kind of been running things and operating over these years. It's really the same organization, whether you call it the Process or the Hand of Death,
Yep.
or whatever else you want to refer to it as. It really is this one single, continuous cult operation that has all these major serial killers doing work for it, and then they later get shown off to society as lone nuts, and very few people ever go into the threads that are connecting it all up with each other. You very rarely get a person like A.W., for example, who can give you the full picture of a world that most people would rather not even imagine exists, of what's really going on behind the scenes.
No, I'm also positive of that. It's just really unbelievable how everything is connected with each other. Also, I purchased the book Henry Lucas, The Shocking True Story of America's Most Notorious Serial Killer by Dr. John Norris. And that's also like a very interesting author. He really demonstrates also the connection that we're trying to make with ritual abuse, with military backgrounds, with he's really genuinely searching for alternative motives for reasons.
Right, and I think that in general with the Henry Lee Lucas case, I think that having a nuanced view of it is very important, because obviously back in the 80s when it first broke, there was this mass hysteria of, well, he probably could even be guilty of 300 murders. And then, of course, when people realized that wasn't really true, it really swung the other way to, well, he probably wasn't guilty of any murders. And ultimately, both of these are contributing to a cover-up of what really happened, if you believe either one of those perspectives on the story. But nowadays, it seems that the pervasive view is that every single one of his confessions was false, that he never really committed any murders beyond, maybe his mother and Becky Powell and Kate Rich, and those are the only ones that were really done by him. I think that, really, and Joel Norris was one of the few in his book who really went into, realizing that, yeah, there was some unfounded stuff, but at the same time, he really does appear to have been a mass killer. And, I appreciated that, that Joel Norris was seemingly one of the few clear-headed people who didn't just jump right onto the bandwagon of it's all a hoax. So I think that just for that reason alone, having the book is quite valuable. Yeah. And it seems that a lot of that history is now forgotten and not really talked about in the context of the Lucas case anymore. And I think that investigating it from scratch and really, looking at each case one by one to see if it stands on its own merits is necessary, because what I've come to believe, especially in past few months of my own research, is that there is a lot about the Lucas case that just seems too compelling and matches up with too much other stuff that's known. At the very least, the Hand of Death appears to be a real institution, just because the way in which Lucas describes his own recruitment into the Hand of Death is a very uncanny parallel to how Thomas Creech described his recruitment into the satanic cult that he was part of. Thomas Creech, if you read that We Magazine article, is OWI, but I think pronounced We. That article called The All-American Death Angel, which was on the Program to Kill forum that people can join. If you read that and you look through it all, or go to the CAVDEF page on Thomas Creech, I've uploaded it there as well, you'll see that Thomas Creech basically, according to him, his first major connection with all of this was when he was approached by a man who was in the auto transport business, the business of delivering cars to people around the country, rental cars to people around the country. And Thomas Creech basically said he was approached by this auto transport businessman, who happened to be formerly a pornography kingpin in Monaco, near France, and was also on the board of some savings and loan company in Salt Lake City, Utah. Basically, this auto transport businessman approached Creech and asked him if he wanted a job delivering cars filled with heroin shipments to various destinations around the country. And this was pretty much the initial contact that brought Creech, to be connected with organized crime interests, and eventually that graduated into the contract murders that he claimed to have committed. So the interesting thing, and I only really discovered this when reading the Max Call's book, Hand of Death, about Henry. There was Henry Lee Lucas's own narrated account of his backstory. Lucas pretty much described the exact same thing, that he was approached by a man named, given the pseudonym of Don Metric. I don't think that's his real name, but that is the name given in the book. And Don Metric pretty much took Henry to Shreveport, Louisiana, and told Lucas, I'm in the auto transport business. I want to give you a job driving these, shipments, these contraband shipments around the country. And Lucas refused because he was worried that he might be stopped driving a stolen car and then be sent back to prison. So that's when Metric gave Lucas the proposition of committing contract murders instead, because Lucas was already murdering people at the time. So, yes, it seems very fascinating to me that, a decade apart, these two serial killers are telling pretty much the same exact story of their recruitment into a satanic cult. And it's very unlikely that Lucas would have been able to come across this rather obscure account of Creech saying this. So it, in my view, at least adds to the likely credibility of Lucas actually being in that death cult. And at the same time, also, I did post this on the programtokill.net forum and also on CAVDEF, that recently did obtain some FBI documents on Lucas. And some of these FBI documents have an interview with both him and Toole talking about the Hand of Death. And at one point, while talking about this, Henry Lee Lucas actually says that the Hand of Death cult was involved in the death squads in El Salvador, which is very, this is a very significant thing to point out, because the death squads in El Salvador were being trained from the very beginning by the CIA. Some of them were even being trained at Fort Benning, Georgia, where Henry Lee Lucas's cousin, Bobby Joe Long, had received his own military training. And ultimately, Henry Lee Lucas was, by bringing up these death squads, essentially connecting the Hand of Death to U.S. intelligence yet again. And so how is it that we have this uneducated drifter, shouldn't know that much about the world, certainly should not know this stuff about, all these different sordid operations that U.S. intelligence is involved in, and yet somehow his stories continually end up lining up with things that we know U.S. intelligence was doing. He talked about training camps in the Everglades, and it turns out that, the U.S. intelligence, that the CIA was training anti-Castro Cubans in the Everglades, first for an invasion of Cuba, and then later for the Iran-Contra affair as well. And then he brings up the death squads in El Salvador, and keep in mind...
Made statements about Jim Jones.
Yeah, that too. He wouldn't know that Jim Jones was, in the CIA, was obviously in the employ of the CIA. He wouldn't likely know that the death squads were being CIA run, or that the Everglades camps were being CIA run. Hell, he probably wouldn't even know about the death squads at all, considering that most Americans didn't really know until years later. So the fact that Lucas has all of this knowledge about so many of these things is, and that he just happens to be again and again bringing up these other, organized violent groups that happen to have CIA affiliations. It seems to be happening way too many times to be coincidental. He just seems to know so much, about the hidden history of the country and of the world, that you certainly would not expect someone of his, mental level to know unless they really were there. It just seems like it's too much for this uneducated drifter to make up on his own.
Yeah. I read 113 pages. I'm now chapter 6, Becky. And the first chapters were also about the Hand of Death cult, the whole procedure and the whole alignment, how they do everything. But I will. It's a physical book, but I will type everything over on the forum so people can read it then.
Yeah, I think that everyone should have a chance to look through it. It's a very valuable book to have. I'm glad that I personally got a copy recently as well, and it's an incredibly important read.
Maybe one last thing. Have you new information about North Fox Island? Because I uploaded my latest 2 podcasts from the upcoming video series. But do you have like maybe new information? Because not to be denigrating, but the podcast was like a lot of information that we already a little bit knew. So
Yeah, unfortunately, not really yet. I think that obviously the connection, the overlap with John Ramsey's father, the potential overlap with John Ramsey's father is an interesting one that I still am hoping to dig more into. Just the fact that John Bonet's paternal grandfather, James Dudley Ramsey, was in charge of the Michigan Aeronautics Commission, and at the time that North Fox Island had the airstrip being built, and he likely would have been in a position to approve whatever was going on and oversee what was going on. So there are some very real questions about whether John Ramsey's own family had, some connection with this enterprise. But it really is just speculation at this point. Can't say I have any much new stuff right now. I guess also the money man behind North Fox Island, Adam Aristotle Starchild, formerly known as Malcolm Willis McConaughey, was he's another person who I think should be looked at, because he has this general profile of seeming to likely be an intelligence operative. The fact that he was an expert in opening up these secret bank accounts, and an expert in financial fraud and tax fraud, that he had books published by Paladin Press in Boulder, Colorado, of all places. And I think that Adam Starchild just seems like a very blatant spook operative, and potentially one of the key, core architects of the whole thing. So he's another person who I think people should look at more. But in terms of new findings, really, I don't have anything yet. But I do hope to update people with what I find, because there are some leads that I'm looking at.
no, I found a 2-page news article about Francis Sheldon, about his whole upbringing and his whole life. So I'll also type that out. I think that's very interesting to have like an overview of his whole life.
Yeah, one of the things that stood out to me, first of all, Francis Sheldon, he owned property all over the country, but in particular, he owned the so-called Wendigo Ranch in Aspen, Colorado, which was fascinating to me because that is exactly where Fleet White Sr., Fleet White Sr. is the patriarch of the White family that showed up in the John Benet Ramsey
the
case.
oil executive, yeah.
Yeah, and so it's interesting that he owned a property there, and also that Sheldon had a background in the oil geology business, because once again, that is a similarity with what the White family was up to. So all that sort of made me wonder about the possibility that Sheldon may have overlapped with the White family, and since we're talking about Aspen, Colorado in the 70s, that's also the same time period that Bundy himself was on trial for some of these murders, and that the period that Ben Meyers is the undersheriff of the county at the time. So it seems that these people are pretty much always congregating in the same place wherever we go.
No, I do want to say I'm very anxious to see in January that 4-part 60-hour video series, because they're also gonna say things about the case of John D. Norman, and there's never been a documentary released or anything, so I'm really anxious for that.
Yeah, I really do want to see what happens when that finally hits the mainstream. People might realize that, at least I'm hopeful that people might start to realize that the whole notion of serial killers that we've been fed for a long time may be totally at odds with reality.
Exactly, yeah. And you can also make like a weird comparison with the coronavirus, like really like a wake-up call from things are not exactly what they have been told.
Right. I really, it certainly you do want to be optimistic and think maybe this time the state, really overplayed their hand, that they went too far, and that people really are starting to question things more than they ever have before.
I think they overplayed their hand by far, but 2021 is really going to be the year of awakening, or it's going to be all over, I think.
Yeah, it's dark to say it, but yeah, at a certain point, it really is. People have to start coming to terms with what's going on, or we may end up going down a road that will be even harder to claw our way back up from.
No, I don't want to go like deeply in this, because it's also so fucking pessimistic everything. But it's also like if you really do your investigation, you can also see that they're like making plans to like get rid of a large part of the population. So you can also maybe see for ourselves that within 10 years there are only like 2 billion people around the earth. I mean,
yeah, really, I think what's important is, if it was really just hopeless, there wouldn't be any point in doing this work. We would just have to lie down and accept it. The reason we do this is because we think that there is hope, that we can reveal to people what's going on and get enough of them to, come to terms with it, and then they'll start, congregating and demanding action to a level that eventually won't be possible to ignore. That's really why we do this, and I think that we have a shot of playing whatever small part we have in helping the population wake up.
Yeah. No, whatever happens, I'm very proud of everything that I've achieved, and I've reached a lot of people. So
yeah, absolutely.
it is important to we always demonstrate all the facts of the case and be objective and not get emotional or with really have integrity, which is a big word nowadays.
Yeah, seems often to be in short supply. So the good thing is when you have it, when you act with it, there will be people who mock you for it, but there are also people for whom it really stands out and it really makes an impression.
Do you have maybe any last thing that you want to say? Any important?
No, I just think everyone out there who's listening, I applaud you for being willing to go down this road, for trying to understand the full reality of what's happening in this world. And
Yep.
it may sometimes feel like a lonely task, but people like you, the numbers are ever growing. There will be more people on your side before you know.
Also, let's hope next year, 2021 in January, when everything hits the 4-part documentary, I think also a lot of people will. Let's hope.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a good chance.
Okay, very nice speaking with you, George, and I wish you a happy New Year already. I don't know how do you say it in English? And happy transfer year.
Yeah, happy New Year. That you got it right.
Okay.
Yeah, it was great coming on again. It's always great to be here. I hope you have an amazing holiday season and New Year, and let's be sure to talk again soon.
Yeah. Tomorrow I'm gonna visit my family and my brother, so that will be good. I also hope for you the same. So I hope to speak with you in the new year very soon. Thanks, George.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. Take care. Have a great day.
Thanks. Bye.